our first hybrid program that we've had. So I thank you very much for bearing with us with this process. We have about a dozen people joining us on via Zoom right now. And so for the people on Zoom, if you could remain muted, and if you have questions, please type them into the chat function in there. And if you have any technical issues, feel free to type them in there as well, and I will do my best to help you. But for now, just if you could save your questions for the end, and I can get to those questions when we get to that portion of the evening. Tonight, we welcome Sheridan Steele, the author of From Bare Dens to the Oval Office, and copies of the books will be for sale in the front room after the talk. And I'm sure if you would like to get them autographed, or signed, he will do so. Sheridan retired from the National Park Service in 2015 after working in 7 different national parks around the United States. He has extensive experience managing all aspects of national park operations, including resource management, interpretation and visitor services, facilities management, as well as ranger operations such as search and rescue, law enforcement, emergency medical services, and wildland firefighting. His last assignment was at Acadia National Park, where he was superintendent for 12 years. During those 38 years working with the National Park Service, he paid special attention to land conservation, youth engagement in nature, promoting a quality visitor experience in the parks, and improving gateway community relations. Sheridan's 2020 book, From Bare Dens to the Oval Office, is a collection of true stories relating his varied experiences as a career National Park ranger and manager, with a particular focus on amusing visitor incidents and the protection of park resources through land conservation and special projects to improve the national park experience. The book also explores the role of the National Park Ranger as a highly skilled individual dedicated to the NPS mission of preserving America's natural and cultural heritage for present and future generations, and encouraging appropriate public use and enjoyment. And all proceeds from the sale of his book will be donated to the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks. So with that, I hand you over to Sheridan.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. And thank you for coming out on this damp evening, to say the least. It's so nice to have you here. Do we want to dim these lights? Would it make a difference?
Yep.
You think?
The wrong light. And that's the wrong
It's
light.
like our house, too many switches. Well, Lisa, that was a good introduction, and it actually will I will show a little bit of that again. All right.
That's not good enough.
Yep. So, can people on Zoom hear me?
Yes,
I'm wondering.
we can
So
hear
I
you.
didn't turn on my microphone. Now, can people on Zoom hear me?
Yes.
The
Yep.
Okay, the screen though, now that you turn the lights off, it just like has white rectangles and I can't read the right.
Oh,
Oh, I'll
Okay.
turn the lights back on.
yeah.
Thank you for telling us that. Now.
Okay,
you
better.
can see now?
Yes, I can see now
Good.
and I can hear.
Oh, great.
Thank
can hear
you.
Too. Thanks. All right, so I've given lots of public programs over my career, and people would often, I'd like to tell stories, and people would often say you should write a book. So when I retired, I got a little bit bored, and I just started writing this book, and pretty soon I had this done after a couple of years, and it's just fun to share it with people. I think it's both entertaining as well as informative about issues facing the national parks. So this just quickly looks at where I've worked in my career. I started out at Cuyahoga Valley in Ohio and ended up, as Lisa said, at Acadia National Park. Along the way, I worked at Black Canyon and Rocky Mountain and Fort Scott National Historic Sites. And I happened to be in Washington, D.C. for a one-year program, and That was my only urban experience. Lisa mentioned what the mission of the National Park Service is, but I think it's useful background. It's really to preserve natural and cultural resources for present and future generations to enjoy. And it's a wonderful mission. It's very clear, although you can sometimes see that there needs to be a balance between use, enjoyment, and preservation. But that makes it, I think, a fun job, a challenging job to make that balance appropriate. And I thought I would just show a typical park organization would have a superintendent and a deputy superintendent, and then these various departments, which Lisa mentioned earlier, as the way we kind of organize our work. And so my first superintendent's job was at Fort Scott National Historic Site in Kansas. I never thought I would be in Kansas in the National Park Service, but it turned out to be a really great assignment. It was a frontier fort that had been largely restored and recreated. And we did what we called costumed interpretation, or living history, some people called it. And we would wear replica, well, volunteers and staff would wear replica clothing from the time period. That happens to be my wife, Barb, and my daughter there on the right. One of our many, some of our many volunteers. But the fort historically had both, I went too fast there, both, yeah, I know, I can't go back, I guess, but had both dragoons, which were the forerunner of the cavalry, so they were mounted infantry basically, and infantry. And so we would do programs there at the fort using many volunteers, some called reenactors. These were people who studied the time period and had all of the appropriate clothing and equipment to interpret or do living history in the time period. And so the fort had many of these kind of activities, and as part of the visitor services program. All of these folks are volunteers, and those are all volunteer horses, as I used to say. They would bring their horses and do programs for the public. So it had a giant stable building where at one time there were 80 horses. These are in the lower right there, dressed as dragoons. So they were the ones that would ride the horses. There were 33 different rooms that were furnished in the time period, like seen here. And the fort was had routine demonstrations like cannon firings, and but it was situated with tallgrass prairie on two sides. The town of Fort Scott was across a plaza, and then the other side was a riverbank of the Marmaton River. So historically, of course, it would have been a lot of tall grass prairie around the fort. So I like to tell this one story about a living history event. So we would often have these living history things where the soldiers, the reenactors, would come and spend the weekend or a couple days and a couple nights on the fort grounds. The teepees there happen to be from a Mountain Man festival, so don't get confused, but the soldiers would stay in tents or in the barracks actually, and provide programming for the public. But they would live that weekend like they were in the military. And so they would have a guard that would walk around the perimeter at nighttime, all night long. And sometimes the infantry would play tricks on the dragoons and vice versa. So one night, it was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, one of the guards heard something going on in the prairie. And so he challenged, said, "Who, identify yourself," something like that. And heard some rustling, and pretty soon he lowered his weapon and he said, "Identify yourself." And out of the tall grass prairie came a naked man and woman, said, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." And they had come over from one of the bars, I guess, that were close in town, and thought they'd have a little privacy. It didn't work out. But from Fort Scott, we went to Washington DC for 1 year, a management development program. I worked for a committee in Congress as an intern that deals with national park issues. So it was really a great learning experience. Our kids were in middle school and elementary school, and it was quite a switch in environment from a small town in Kansas to Washington, DC. But after that year, I was transferred to Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado as the deputy superintendent. And so again, that contrast from Washington, DC to Colorado was quite stark for our kids and for us too. It was wonderful. But Rocky Mountain National Park is much larger than, let's say, Acadia. It's 400 square miles, gets 3 million visitors a year. I'm sure it's more than that now, but 3 million when I was there. It's just a beautiful mountain environment and lends itself to lots of great hiking and what have you. But so that happened to be our house up there in the slide. You can see going from Washington, DC to Estes Park, Colorado, we had elk in the yard all the time. We had occasional coyotes and deer, and you could see bear occasionally and so forth. It was really going from the urban life of Washington to what I say is the wildlife of Colorado. In fact, these pictures were taken in our yard. You never knew what you were going to see when you woke up in the morning and looked out. So the deputy superintendent at Rocky Mountain is really the chief of operations and responsible for everything going on in the park on a daily basis. So whether it's wildland firefighting or search and rescue, wildlife management, management of campgrounds, spring opening, all of that stuff fell under the purview of the deputy superintendent. So it made it really extremely fun and interesting job. And we had at the time between 20 and 50 major search and rescue operations in the park and a year. And that was always interesting, of course, and challenging because some of the rescues were very technical and therefore very complex. But we had swift water rescues sometimes because of the mountain streams, particularly in spring runoff. But I thought I would tell you about one particular incident. This happened in on Hallett Peak. So the peak in the very middle of that slide with a dark face on it, that's Hallett Peak. It's over 13,000 feet in elevation. And one day, 3 climbers, the lead climber above the other 2 fell on top of the 2 below them, knocked them onto a ledge, and one of the climbers ended up with serious back injuries. So it was going to be a very technical, very complex operation. We had to fly 22 people and all of their equipment to the top of Mount Hallett by helicopter to effect this rescue. And on the very last trip, there was one rescuer and some equipment going to the top, and the pilot was from Fort Collins, and his daughter was having a piano recital that night. So he wanted to go directly from the top of Hallett to Fort Collins in time to make his daughter's recital. So he loaded on extra fuel. Well, we always have what's called a helicopter manager at this operation to double check calculations. They always calculate how much weight was in the helicopter, how much fuel was on board, what the air temperature was, all those things to determine what the load capacity of the helicopter was at this elevation. So long story short, the helicopter manager said, "You're overweight. You need to do something about that." And he said, "I'm not overweight." And she showed him the calculation. She said, "You have too much fuel. You need to take it off." He said, "I'm the pilot." He said, "I'd say I'm not overweight." And he took off. And I'll show you what happened. This is what happened. He crashed into the top of Mount Hallett, which then complicated not only that rescue, but then we had to deal with this crashed helicopter up there and get that out. And so it turned into a 2-day operation. Nobody was hurt in that crash. Fortunately, it could have been very serious because when the rotors hit the ground, they splintered and become shrapnel. And fortunately, that people were behind rocks and were able to avoid serious injury. the pilot not only lost his helicopter, he lost his job.
Yeah.
It was late for the recital.
He did not make the recital, right. So Rocky Mountain has these backcountry cabins like this one in the lower right there. That's the Fern Lake cabin. And they would, sometimes the rangers would have meetings up at these backcountry cabins. And one day I was, on weekends, I would monitor the park radio to see what was going on in the park. If there was some reason for me to be there, I would join the work. Anyway, so this was a Saturday morning. I turned on the radio and I'm in the middle of hearing a middle of a conversation. And it turned out there were some rangers up at the Fern Lake cabin, and they wanted to know when Ranger Oliver was going to get to the cabin. And the dispatcher said, well, he's still here at headquarters. He's leaving soon. They said, well, when is he leaving? And what is his ETA up here at the cabin? And they said it'd probably be an hour and a half because it's like a 5-mile hike to get in there. And so they said, does he have the item? And I thought, that's not a good sign. I thought maybe this is a rescue. The item might be a body bag, something like that, you know, that they don't want to say on the radio. So I called dispatch. I said, so what's going on up at Fern Lake cabin? And they said, oh, there's a meeting going on with the district rangers. And I said, really? I said, so what is the item? And they said, it's a peach pie. So they were waiting for Lori's peach pie. They didn't care about the meeting. So I was relieved. But so, and we would have these animal jams at Rocky when people would spot an elk or a deer near the trail and they'd want to take a picture. So they'd stop. Pretty soon everybody'd stop, and then you'd get this situation where nobody could move because, and some people would literally get out of their car, leave it right in the middle of the road, and go take a picture. But the elk, particularly, and moose were very dramatic and great to get pictures of. And we also had bighorn sheep that would come across this particular road to get to an animal lick or a mineral lick down in the meadow there. And in order to facilitate their movement back and forth, we had volunteers like my wife, who she said were crossing guards. So they would, when the sheep, so when the sheep were trying to get across the road, we would stop traffic. And the people in the front, you could see they got a really nice view. The people a quarter mile back, they were honking their horn occasionally, saying, what's going on? What's going on? So the people in front, though, got a great view. And the sheep would go down to the meadow for a while, and then they'd go back. We'd stop traffic. So wildlife management was a big part of our job at Rocky. I mean, the national parks job. And this particular view here, this is, we would occasionally put radio collars on elk for research purposes, as well as bears. But so this helicopter, they would fly over the herd. They'd separate out one elk just by maneuvering around, and then they'd shoot a net over that elk. And then the elk would freeze basically because it couldn't move. And these guys would jump out of the helicopter and blindfold it, put a radio collar on it and release it. And that would take all of maybe a minute. And then they'd release the elk and it'd have this radio collar for research purposes. And we called that catch and release elk hunting. But we had black bears that also had collars on, and that's part of my title of my book. I'm not going to tell you any stories about that. You'll have to read the book. But that was really interesting. And if you want, I'll talk about that later. But backcountry management. So Rocky Mountain was a big wilderness park, and there was a lot of backcountry issues. And so management would often go out on these trips into the backcountry to deal with various issues. And we used horses and mules there at Rocky Mountain. We had 25 horses and mules for work inside the park. And I always said that I wanted to get out with the rangers when I was working there. And so this guy on the right here, Jim Coretti, he invited me to go on a 22-mile horse trip out to these lakes, Nanita and Nakoni, out and back in one day. So that's a pretty long trip. And I said, yeah, I'd love to go. So I met him at the trailhead at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he had a horse ready for me. And we saddled up or loaded up and went up the trail. And so I didn't know anything about my horse, but his name was Beamer. And it turns out Beamer was donated to the park by a rancher in Oklahoma who was retiring. And he wanted his favorite horse to have this national park retirement experience. So anyway, he donates Beamer to the park, and I get on Beamer and we head up the trail, and we get maybe a half a mile or so up the trail. And we come to this bridge, and Beamer freezes. He's not going to go across the bridge. And so Curecanti, that's what everybody called Jim Curecanti, he said, yeah, Beamer doesn't like bridges, so we got to make him go across. So we're pushing and pulling, and we get him across the bridge, and I get back on the horse, and another mile or two, and we come to a creek, and same thing, Beamer, no, he's not going across that creek. So we literally push him and drag him through the creek. I get back on, and then lastly, we get way up high, and we're on this like cliff area, and Beamer doesn't want to go around this cliff. And I didn't particularly either, but Curecanti and I got him around the cliff, and we get back on. And at this point, I said, Jim, I got a couple questions for you. So why do we have Beamer? And secondly, why did you bring him for me? And the answer was, well, we're trying to see if he's going to work out. Well, that was Beamer's first and last season at Rocky. Another interesting project took 2 years, Bluebird Lake restoration. So this just gives you an example of the kinds of issues that we were dealing with. There was a man-made dam up here at Bluebird Lake that was built in the late 1800s to be an irrigation source of irrigation water down in the Front Range, down near Fort Collins. And so it would store water and they would release it at times. Well, the dam became unmaintained and dangerous, so we wanted to remove it. Well, that was almost 11,000 feet elevation, was 12 and a half miles back from the trailhead. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do it by flying in heavy equipment. We had to do it in pieces and reassemble the equipment up there, and then start working to tear down this concrete reinforced dam. And the crews that were hired to do this, they worked 12-hour days. They worked 3 days. We'd fly them in. They'd spend their nights at this, what they called a boonie barn, this tent down there in the middle. And we had a cook hired for them that would prepare meals and what have you. And then we'd fly them out at the end and fly another crew in. So it took all of one summer to demolish that dam and leave it in basically piles. So the second year, so this was a shot of them demolishing that dam with this equipment. Then the second year, we used a sky crane that would fly the material out in these big dump truck body kind of things and into a pile, and then it would be carted off from the park. And so our son was, I think, 11 at the time. And I said, you know, we've got this operation going on up at Wild Basin, this area here. I said, I'm sure you'd be interested in it. So we took him up there with a lawn chair and an ice cooler of lunch and drinks and stuff. And he sat there and watched the operation all day. It was like the best day of his career, his life. And that's our son standing next to this great machine. This thing could carry 10,000 pounds at 10,000 feet elevation, which is really amazing. The other interesting thing about this machine is it had two pilots, one that faced forward and one that faced back. And when it had a load, it was the pilot in the back that was flying it because it could watch what was going on, either getting a load or taking it somewhere. And then spring opening was also an interesting situation. Every year was different, but at Rocky Mountain, you could have lots of snow, obviously. And just to give you an example, that upper right or upper left corner there, that's the Alpine Visitor Center up on top at about 12,000 feet. And many years, the building was literally buried when it came time to open it for spring. And so you can see there in the bottom center, the snow is packed right in against the windows and doors. And we used heavy equipment to get close enough to the building. We could then use shovels to open it up. And the upper right corner, those are actually students that were hired to dig tunnels into the windows of the main building up there so they could get some light inside as they were opening it up. And then that line there on the left, they're waiting for a restroom that's literally buried. And the way we determined where the buildings were in the spring, we used snow poles that you can see up there, upper right. So they would put those in the fall, and then come spring, you would clear and you would avoid the snow poles because that meant something underneath there was important, like this building. And they would line the highway. And I was up there at the visitor center one day in my uniform, and this guy pulled up. It was spring, it was fall. They had all those poles up, but there was no snow yet. And he said, "Hey, I want to ask you a question." I said, "Yeah, what?" He said, "All those poles," he said, "do you fly flags from those?" He said, "It must be really pretty." I said, "Well, there are literally hundreds of them." And I said, "Well, there's snow poles." And I explained. He said, "Oh, of course, I should have known."
Oh.
So we used these heavy rotary plows and to open up, and it took about a month of plow work every day of the week to open the road. And you could see the drifts along the road could be 25 or 30 feet high in places. When I was at Rocky, we had the Pope there for a visit, and we also had the Emperor and Empress of Japan. And again, I'm not going to tell you stories about them, but there are good stories when they're visiting and the preparations and so forth. But from Rocky, I went to Black Canyon and the Gunnison National Park as superintendent. And that's an amazing place. It's 2,700 feet deep, and it's as narrow as 40 feet wide in places down at the bottom. And the river drops 95 feet per mile. So to give you an idea of the scale of that little bug in the middle, there's actually a helicopter.
Wow.
And it's doing some, this happened to be a search and rescue in there, but it was quite a dramatic canyon and a very interesting place to work. So it was a national monument when I moved there. And the difference between a national monument and a national park is the national monuments can be created by the presidential proclamation. So the president says, "I think this particular area should be preserved," and he signs the proclamation making it a national monument. All other units of the national park system require an act of Congress, legislation. And so when I went there, it was still a national monument. And we would have visitors who would drive the canyon rim road and hike in the canyon and so forth. And they'd come back into the visitor center and they'd say, "Wow, that canyon is gorgeous, but we never saw the monument. Where is the monument?" They were expecting to see something like this thing on the right there, which actually wasn't in the park. But, it's just funny. It's just terminology, and, people didn't really understand what a national monument was. But in 1999, legislation was passed making a national park, an official national park. And I was invited to go to Washington to be at the signing ceremony in the Oval Office with President Clinton. And these other three people there in the picture besides me are the local senators and congressmen from Colorado who were also there at the signing. It was a great experience, and President Clinton was very interested in the national parks and said he wanted to visit that when he was out of office. But from Black Canyon, I went to Acadia, came to Acadia, and spectacular place, as we all know, and very attractive. 3 million people a year, but now it's up to 4. And we know there's certainly some challenges related to that. This happened to be a high surf day there at Thunder Hole. It always depended on the tides and the surf of whether there was really any action at Thunder Hole. And some days it was very dramatic, as this day was. And you probably know about Acadia's historic ladder trails, Beehive. Beehive has become famous for some reason. Now people come to Acadia just to hike the Beehive. But the more infamous or a famous trail is the Precipice, as you probably know, 1,100 feet up by ladders and cliffs and what have you. And I had to talk Barb into going on this trail, the Precipice.
He
And
lied to me.
she went.
Said it wasn't too bad. Yeah.
We went with my daughter and her husband, and so her husband is a mountain climber, and so he's not at all intimidated by the ladders or the exposure to cliffs. And so this is Barb and our son-in-law Matt making sure she doesn't fall off this cliff. But I'd like to tell a story about a young married couple that was. This is a true story. They were in the parking lot. They were arguing about whether they were going to do this trail or not, this climb. And she was really kind of berating him because he didn't want to go. He said, I don't like heights. I really don't think this is a good idea. And she said, I know you can do it. Let's just do it. And we'll just be so happy that we get to the top. And he finally, she just pushed him enough that he said, okay, I'll go. And so he gets about halfway up and he says, I'm not going any further. They're going to have to call the Rangers because I am not moving. And so she goes to the top, calls on cell phone, get the Rangers to come with some equipment to get this guy to the top. And usually when the Rangers show up in a situation like that, they're like, oh, thanks for coming. We're so glad to see you and stuff. Instead, this guy goes, what the hell took you so long? And he jumps on the Rangers and he's mad. Of course, he's probably embarrassed, but so they get him to the top. And of course, she's waiting for him. And he gets to the top and she jumps on him. She says, I knew you were a chicken. I knew you should, blah, 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 blah. And, everybody's like this. But she happens to be wearing flip-flops and you have to go down a different trail. And on the way back down, she trips on her flip-flops and breaks her ankle. So then we had to carry her out on a stretcher. But the staff thought maybe there's some little payback in there. We don't know if they're still married, but yeah. Anyway, Barb said, well, I've done it once, never again.
Why did they take him up and not just bring him back down?
It's so much harder to go down, particularly on the ladders. And so they had to get him to the top. In fact, we advise nobody to go down on the ladders. We want everybody to go up and then circle back a different route to come down because it really, first of all, when you're looking down, instead of up, you're looking down maybe a couple hundred feet instead of up maybe 10 feet. And so it's a very different thing psychologically. Well, in 2006, the Obama family came to Acadia, and I could tell you many stories about that. I did in the book, but I'll tell you a couple from this particular event. So we were to greet the president and the first family up on top of Cadillac, and then they were going to walk around the top and so forth. And the way it was supposed to work was we would close the road to Cadillac 90 minutes before the president was to come up. And then just let people filter out and they wouldn't know that the president was coming. However, at the end of that kind of 90-minute period, there were only a few cars left in the parking lot up, and this is June on Cadillac Mountain. And the smart people went, hey, something's not right here. This parking lot's almost empty. So they thought, they knew that Obamas were on the island. And so they started hanging around. So finally the Secret Service said, yeah, you can stay. Somebody is coming up, but you need to be over here. And they wanted them all and had bomb sniffing dogs go over the cars and stuff. And because we were going to be this close to the president, first family, they told Barb, you need to wear a lapel pin, like this big lapel pin. And they said tongue in cheek, this is so you don't get shot. Because anybody that was going to be within 25 feet that they didn't know had to wear these lapel pins. So anyway, long story short, Barb loses her lapel pin while we're waiting. And she says to me, oh, my lapel pin, I can't find it. I'm going to go get another one. And I said, I don't think that's gonna work very well. And the Secret Service said, well, you better go find it, which she did. So it turned out fine, but and they were charming folks. But the other favorite story of mine is we went out on the park boat with the Obama family, and you can see we're wearing life jackets here. And we had life jackets for the first family, but we didn't, they were wearing them. And but we had 6 of these patrol boats around us out on Frenchman Bay, had a helicopter overhead, and we had a rescue swimmer on board. So that's a Coast Guard guy who would dive into the worst possible situation and save a life. And he was ready to go in. He had his flippers right there and everything. Anyway, we're out on Frenchman Bay. We come back, and the news media is taking pictures of all this out there. And they started asking questions. How come the park ranger has a life jacket on, but the Obamas don't? So they were thinking that, you know, maybe that the Obamas were breaking the law or something. Well, really, it's not a requirement. It's just they had to be on board. And I was trying to set an example. So there were 2 answers to that question. How come I was wearing a life jacket and they weren't? The official answer was they didn't need one. We had them on board. They were ready. Had really need them and so forth. And the unofficial answer was, well, there was a rescue swimmer on board. And had one of the Obamas gone over, he'd have saved their life just as fast as you could do that. Had I gone overboard, he would have probably said, "Oh, Captain, the superintendent, you better turn around."
Send a boat from New York.
So anyway, it was a great career. I love to hear positive comments from visitors. I heard this kid say, "Oh, Mom, Dad, come down here quick." He was down by the tide pools. He said, "This is awesome," you know, and that kind of reaction, particularly from kids, is just wonderful. And my 38 years was just flew by because I really loved working in the national parks, serving the American public, and having that great mission. So I'm going to say thank you for now. That's Barb there with one of those drifts. I think that one was maybe 30 feet tall. I don't know, 25. Anyway, that was at Rocky Mountain. So I would be happy to answer questions and talk more about the book and what have you. Can people ask questions from?
Yes, they can. Do you want to stand up front
Sure.
or?
Yep.
Yeah, I'll rearrange this.
So I turned that microphone off. Let's
Yep.
see if that works.
Oh, I need you to stop sharing your screen.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
It's all this technical.
I know, there's just. Yeah.
Oh,
Can you see us?
Who are you asking?
yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I see a question in the back already. Can folks out there hear me on Zoom?
Absolutely. Oh,
Good.
Hear
Good.
you.
Yes.
How tall was the visitor center?
So
Mountain?
I would say it was a typical single-story building with a steep roof, and it was probably about 20 feet. And the one year I went up there when the snow was the deepest, the only thing you could see of the roof was about the last 6 inches of it. And you could literally walk right to the peak of the roof. And it took them extra time to open the park to across the top because of the snow depth. Yes.
The dam that you deconstructed, did
Yep.
you leave it open then? Was the water free flowing or did you replace?
Yeah,
it?
so there was a natural lake there to begin with. They added the dam to make it deeper and to make it into a reservoir. So when we removed the dam, the natural lake returned,
Oh.
but there was what we call a bathtub ring around where the water had been for, I don't know, 75 or 80 years. But it still is now fully restored. Yeah.
I
Yes.
have another question about the dam. Did you take it apart slowly so there wasn't like a flood?
No, so they built, well, that's a really sharp question. They built a coffer dam behind it, meaning they would hold the water back from the concrete dam. And they lowered the water level in the dam or behind the dam to begin with. And then they chipped it apart and until they could fly it all out. And like I said, there was a natural lake there, so there was some water there, but it was behind this, they call it a coffer dam, a temporary dam. Yes, sir.
Do you have any good lightning stories up at Long's Peak at Rocky?
Yeah, well, there were certainly, we had lots of lightning incidents. One of the things I remember about incidents at Rocky Mountain was they seemed to come in series of 3. And it was very odd. Like one year we did have 3 lightning strikes, 3 different lightning strikes where visitors were actually struck. And, you know, it's one of those situations where it's really horrible, but you got to get, you know, you got to respond quickly to that, but at the same time, there's a danger there. We had one of the funny stories I remember was up at Long's Peak. Long's Peak faces east, so the weather comes from the west. And so Long's Peak has this great big face on it, 2,000 feet, I think, of rock. And then there's something below that called the boulder field. And there's just giant boulders that you have to make your way across to go up to the top of Long's Peak. And there, somebody had been injured in the boulder field. And so we had a group up there with a metal basket stretcher. They were trying to bring this individual out. And it was,
Metal stretcher.
yeah, and it was the worst time of day. And the storms would come over Long's Peak from the west. And so you wouldn't see them coming. And so this storm was on them like very quickly and they had to do something. So what you do when you're above tree line, which they were, is you've got to make yourself as small as possible. So you kneel down basically and with as little contact to the ground as possible. So you're kind of on your tiptoes and you don't want any metal on your body. So they took off their belts and stuff and they threw them into the basket. And of course, they took the guy out of the basket first. And then they spread out because you don't want to be near somebody. And so you spread out and you just wait for the storm to pass. And so they're all hunkered down and they got the basket over there full of stuff and the injured guy over here and so forth. And everybody spread out. And this guy walks up to him and he goes, "Hey, what's going on here? What is this? What's going on?" And of course, he's now the tallest thing around. And he's like, he's like an antenna. So they're going, "Get away, go over there, lightning, get away." And it finally dawned on this person that he was in danger, but they said the hair on their neck was standing up. That's a really bad sign. Fortunately, there was not anybody hit that time, but it could have been. So. Anybody on the Zoom have a question? I guess they would.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You transitioned from national park to national park. How did that all come about? Were you assigned or was it a matter of there were openings and you got to choose? How did that all?
Yes, that's a really good question. So, so in the national parks, when you're a permanent employee, you can either stay where you are or you can move, but you have to apply for openings. So, like, let's say the superintendent of Acadia, they announced that that job is open because the prior person either transferred or retired. Is he retired? So I saw the announcement and I applied for the job. I was probably one of 40 people who applied for that job and were considered qualified. And then they would do interviews of some and make a selection. And so it was by choice, but it used to be more military, like the military, where they would just say, "We need you in Alaska and you need to report to Denali National Park." And you could say no one time. And if you said no more than once, they called it homesteading. It meant you were there. And whether you wanted to or not. But it became much more open while I was in my career. and it became an apply for a job if you wanted to move. And usually to get a promotion and move up, that's what you would do, would be apply. So, and to give you just a little more information about that. So the superintendent jobs, I was superintendent of 6 different national parks, including Fort Scott National Historic Site, but those are different grade levels. So the Fort Scott was what you would call the beginning level of the superintendent's job. And then each bigger park operation would carry with it a higher grade. So Acadia was one of the highest grade parks, but there's one level above it, which would be Yellowstone and Grand Canyon, and those parks. And I liked Acadia so much, I decided I didn't want to move again. So we stayed here for 12 years, yeah.
Has that been the first time you've been out here? Or have you been? here
Actually,
before?
Bart and I were here on our honeymoon for a couple of days.
Aw,
And when my dream in the National Park Service was to work in the big national parks like Rocky Mountain. And so when I got west to Rocky and Black Canyon, my plan was not to move back east, although we said we might consider Acadia.
Mhm.
And then we happened to come here for a meeting in September of that year when Paul Hartel, my predecessor, announced his retirement. And we drove through the park again, and we always, working in the national parks, when you went to a national park, if you were a permanent employee, you sometimes would drive through the housing area, maybe check out the schools and stuff, thinking, yeah, well, I might apply for this place, you know? And so we drove through Acadia again. We said, wow, you know, it's really spectacular. So we would apply for this opening that was coming up, and we did. And record. So, yes.
Can you talk about St. Croix Islands a little bit? Is that the one like in Maine that we're by the border?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So it's on the St. Croix River. It's
Yeah.
called St. Croix Island International Historic Site. And it became a unit of the National Park System, and it is actually managed by the superintendent of Acadia.
Oh, okay.
So I was sometimes introduced as the superintendent of Acadia National Park and of St. Croix Island. And one time somebody came up to me afterward and said, that's got to be the best job I've ever heard of. I can't imagine 6 months in Acadia, and 6 months in the Caribbean, you know,
Right,
because there is St. Croix
right.
historic site
Virgin
down in the
Islands.
Caribbean, and there actually is a St. Croix Riverway National Recreation Area in Wisconsin. I think. So there are 3 St. Croix in the
Oh.
National Park System.
Yeah,
And,
because I remember many years ago talking about the St. because that was the only St. Croix I knew because
Yeah.
being from Maine. And they're like, oh, how wonderful, the Caribbean. I'm like, wait, what? And yeah, but
Yeah.
I was there like once, but I don't, it was so long ago. All I remember is that it was absolutely gorgeous. And you know how sometimes when you're in a spot, you get this feeling, you just like this really powerful feeling like, yeah, this scene might be beautiful, or that place might be really impressive. But sometimes there's just something that comes over you, like,
Yeah.
this is a special place. I remember that feeling, but I
Yeah.
don't know whether it was part of that park or just a spot in the road we happened along. It
Yeah.
was so, it was like 40 years ago. So
Yeah, yeah.
beautiful area though.
Well, I love that about the national parks. I think they inspire people in different ways.
Yep.
You know, different people in different ways.
Mhm.
Whether it's an interest in history or whether it's a natural area experience. And there's something for everybody, I think. Yeah.
Certainly.
Yes.
What do you think about talking about the management of the park, right? So many visitors in the summer here, there are other parks that have that difficulty too. Like, what's a good way to balance that? I mean, what's your experience?
Well, it's a continuing challenge, of course, and it's particularly difficult for parks like Acadia and Rocky Mountain because visitation is going up dramatically, but the ability to handle that visitation is actually going down. By that, I mean the number of staff people is declining because of budget and because of housing issues. And it's becoming more and more difficult. As a good example of that, Cadillac Mountain has this reservation system now, and it's actually working very well, I think. And people do get to Cadillac, and there are parking places instead of gridlock, which is really good. But one of the popular things to do on Cadillac is to be there at sunrise. So if you're gonna manage a reservation system, that means you've got to have staff to manage it. So now you have staff coming on at 3 o'clock in the morning to manage that reservation system, which you never had before. So that's an impact to staff. That means you need more people instead of less. But we actually have less at Acadia. So it's really a dilemma, and it's happening elsewhere. We live in Colorado part of the year, and I go to Rocky Mountain National Park, and they have a timed entry system, as does Arches and others in the West. And I think for the most part they work, but you know, on the other hand, me as a park manager loving the national parks, I just hate that people can't go when they want to go and be there when they want to be there. It's just really a shame. But people generally say, well, I think it's a better experience. So maybe that's right. Yes, sir.
I think a lot of it has to do with, we can ever get to the point where we can figure out the housing issue.
Yeah.
And to be honest, also the money issue as far as the employees, especially seasonals.
Yeah.
You know, when I came on board, to be honest with you, I thought it was going to be like a barracks. You sleep in one area, you sleep in one area, eat in another area. So it's very surprising that they got actually even physical housing.
Yeah.
But you know, when I came here, this is my first time here. I was very, thank gosh, I had a roommate, because I would to do the house by myself would have been close to $700. There's a guy out in Winter Harbor,
Scooty. Yeah,
Scooty. He threw the whole house. Well, he finally got a roommate, but he did it pretty much by himself. That's the issue, is the housing.
Yeah.
And the pay a little bit, and maybe training too, depending on the position. I mean, I'm in the fee position with the resource and protection, but training's been good, but maybe a little bit more as far as, you know, this year I got to learn a little bit more about SARS and leadership programs, and next week I'll do a ride along to LEs and stuff like that. So I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, well, housing is an issue at all major national parks where there is a resort community, like here, like Rocky Mountain, Grand Teton, because this trend toward weekly rentals and Airbnb basically eliminates all of the local housing that normally a group of seasonals might have been able to rent. So that's gone. So what that means for Acadia and Rocky and others, you have to provide government housing, and which is expensive to build and maintain and so forth, particularly when you're only going to use it 8 or 9 months a year. But without it, you can't hire employees. So Acadia normally would hire 150 seasonals. They have 75 beds in government housing. So where does that other 75 go? Well, either they find a less than desirable situation and are willing to put up with it, or they might be local, in which case that's great. Or they come and they say, I can't find anywhere to live, and they quit. And it's a big problem because we don't have the staffing that we normally would have had.
Well, I know the housing that I'm at now, I mean, again, it's me and one roommate, but I gotta be honest with you, I'm glad that we're not sharing the room, because there would be no privacy. And
Yeah,
that's
sure.
really only gonna be the other issue.
Right.
You know, I mean,
Before COVID, they did share bedrooms.
well,
Then
interesting
COVID,
enough,
they had to stop.
when COVID came out and I was looking around, one of the things I noticed started to happen was they were giving you a choice of housing or an RV site. Now, I didn't see that the last year or this year. I don't know if they stopped that because COVID, I should say it's over, but it's dwindled down a little bit. But I thought, okay, an RV site or housing.
Yeah, we had what we affectionately called the KOA, which was an area where particularly volunteers who had RVs, if they committed to 32 hours a week, we would let them stay in the campground. And that is an option, but I mean, it's a very difficult situation because you can't just get money to build new housing. You know,
Right.
you need it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's something that's got to be addressed because less housing means fewer employees at a time when visitation's going way up. And how do you serve those more and more people
Right.
with less and less employees? It's
Is that common?
yes, it's a
honestly?
major issue, and there is some legislation before Congress to try to help with this. I mean, there's more and more recognition that this is a huge problem.
Didn't Acadia just set aside some land this year to
Well-
build some workforce housing?
It's a little more complicated than that. There is a piece of land, 55 acres in Town Hill, that was what they called a deletion parcel. Park Service was going to give that land up because it wasn't inside the park boundary. So one of the pieces of legislation that I just mentioned is just to allow that 55 acres to be used for workforce housing, 15 acres to stay with the national park and the rest to be in the community. And that will be a good step if
Yeah.
that all happens. But that's not a quick fix. It's gonna take several years to not only get the legislation passed, but then to build housing, so.
Well, I was asking this superintendent this year when I came on about the theory or the thought of permanent seasons, where, like you were saying earlier, you'd be stationed at Acadia for a certain amount of years. So you'd be able to get housing, you maybe, I don't know if they would subsidize it or whatever, but if that might be a road they're gonna have to go down instead of just seasonals. I mean, you can't do without the seasonal, but maybe if you go in the other direction of more career permanent or permanent seasonal somewhere.
Yeah, it's, it gets complicated fast. There's a good example of this long-term seasonal thing. About 15 years ago or so, a seasonal in Washington DC died of a heart attack, and it came out that he had no health insurance, et cetera. So Congress, being right there at the doorstep, they decided something needed to be done about that. So they put a limit on the number of hours that a seasonal employee could work, 1,620, I think is the number. Turns out to be just over 6 months. And because they wanted to force the Park Service into having more permanents and fewer seasonals, so they'd have health insurance and so on. And that works, but the budget never changes, or at least it doesn't change much. So that means you've got to spend your limited number of dollars on fewer number of employees because you're hiring them for longer periods.
Yeah.
They call it subject to furlough when you hire somebody who's not quite permanent. Well, they are permanent, but that's not permanent full time.
But I wouldn't mind doing that, I don't know where I want to go. but-
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Anybody on? Yes.
Otter Creek in the 1930s and 40s had a radio station there. And it was for overseas, especially during the war. And then moved it over to Scudic.
Yeah.
Is that installation still in place or?
So that was called Detachment A, and it, it's an interesting story. And there was this great radio reception, a ham radio operator noticed that he could hear things from Europe and North Atlantic and so forth. Brought it to the attention of the military. The military put an official listening post there, and then Rockefeller was building the Park Loop Road, and that was kind of in the way. So he actually went to the Secretary of Navy, and he got him to move it over to Scudic, and they determined that it was as good over there. So, and that went on for years. And when I first got here, they were just at the point of calling the base over there at Scudic excess, and they were going to give it up. Probably satellites, I'm sure, had made it obsolete. But there is still a very small facility over there. If you look when you're on the road in Prospect Harbor, you can see a radar dome kind of thing over there on the point. That's still official Navy. And there are some listening posts around, antenna, I should say, not listening posts, around that are still being used. But mostly it's been replaced by satellites.
Can I ask you one question about the bear? I know you want to talk about, was it just in one park or have we seen multiple?
I'm
The
sorry.
bears, the bears, and
bears?
the cubs and the den and the.
Well, so that the picture that was on the cover there, that's from Rocky Mountain. I mean, a lot of national parks have bears. There are bears here on NDI, but not many.
Yeah.
I've actually seen one on Pretty Marsh Road.
Oh.
But they're few and far between here. But at Rocky Mountain, we had about a dozen bears with radial collars because we were trying to study what the extent of their territory was. Because they were kind of really at the edge of their viability in terms of what they ate and what was available and so on. Their cubs were small and fewer in number. And so it said that the population was stressed. So we were trying to learn more about it. And one way of doing that was tracking them with radio collars. And then in the winter, we would, using tracking devices, we would go to their den, try to find a den because you just had a general area.
Right.
And then you would want to change the batteries on the collars, get a blood sample, do various other things. So you obviously had to tranquilize them to do that. So you would go in, tranquilize the bear, and
Wow.
but you wouldn't if there were cubs, which in the case of that cover picture, this den had 2 cubs,
Oh,
and you can't tranquilize the cubs for fear of, overdosing
Right.
and so on.
Yeah.
So somebody has to hold them, and of course I.
horrible job.
Yeah.
Could it help if they could help the radio tracking? You think you got a lot of more information to help the bear?
We got a lot of good information, sure, particularly with their size of their habitat and whether there was overlap. It was really very valuable, but also it allowed us to go get blood samples, check their teeth,
Sure.
weigh them, determine, what was going on there in terms of trends. And so it was very valuable information, but it was also somewhat disturbing to the bear. So we tried to minimize that because usually the bear, first of all, the adult is hibernating, so it's asleep.
Right.
And you want it to stay asleep while you're there. But they try to, they know that there's a threat. They sense that because they try to wake up when you're at the den until they're tranquilized. And of course, they want to defend their cubs in this case.
Yeah.
So we found out that they would usually move their den after we'd been there.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that says,
Yeah, I
that
know.
we were disturbing them. And, it's a trade-off,
Yeah.
is the disturbance more of a problem than not knowing about what the needs of the population are.
Yeah.
Maybe long term it helps.
Yeah, well, that was our belief that long term it helped, yeah.
What does a
Well,
bear,
thank you.
what does a bear den look like, or so that to get in there? I mean, what kind of
So
hole in the ground?
it
or-
could be a hole underneath a tree in a bank. It could be, in the case of Rocky Mountain, it was often a big rock fall area where rocks had fallen over the years, and they would find a way into the rocks and underneath and find a space. This particular one that's on the cover there, that's what it was in a rock fall area, was almost a little bit of a cave. And the teams that would go out, there would usually be 5 or 6 people that would go out on these trips. And everybody would carry a snow shovel because in the spring, you get to an area that'd just be a snow field over these rocks, and you just dig holes until you find an opening, basically, in the general area that you're in. Because I was on 2 other trips. One, we never did find it. And one, the bear was able to get back further under the rocks where it was not able to get to it. So.
Are you surprised there's not more bears here on the island?
Actually, I'm surprised there aren't any bears here because of the number of people in the, in the
I'm
jungle.
part with the campgrounds, the amount of people and the food,
Yeah.
maybe they just can't find a way across.
Well, I think it's, first of all, Acadia is a very small national park. It's one of the 10 smallest national parks. And it's also a kind of a patchwork quilt, little here, little there, big there, whatever. Rocky Mountain National Park's a big rectangle. And it's, of course, 265,000 acres, whereas Acadia is about 38,000. So it's a very different situation. Plus, it's surrounded, Rocky Mountain is surrounded by national forest and other public lands. And so there's a lot more habitat for wildlife than there is here. And that's why you do see moose here
Yeah.
occasionally. And a lot of deer, but deer can live in a more urbanized environment than, let's say, elk or moose. And so the big parks in the West have the larger numbers of wildlife because they have more space, basically. Yeah. Anybody on Zoom with a question? Well, I appreciate you all coming out tonight and participating. If I'll be around, and if you have any other questions. And,
Thank you. That was great.
It was.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
and we do have books if anybody wants.
Yes, absolutely.
So my wife here will.
Sorry.
I was gonna ask you,